Hi again. Thanks for coming back. Today I'm really pleased to be able to work with Julie, on my left, and Jessica. So I think I'll turn it over to Julie now and let her continue. Thanks, Julie. We've talked about encouraging students to use writing in their work for learning purposes in the past. Now we want to focus on something a little bit different. We want to consider how we can effectively respond to students' writing. And everybody's favorite topic, how to assess it. So these are the three. I feel that the way you respond to a student's writing really depends on the role you choose to take. And we'll talk about the different roles, the different hats you might wear. Then, as I said, assessment is kind of a cross we bear. And I empathize with teachers in the schools who have to deal with the edicts of No Child Left Behind, and now, Race to the Top. But I like to think of Robert Frost's advice when he said that freedom is feeling easy in your harness. It is a harness that we wear, but I think in talking about writing today and in the whole workshop, we can find ways of working within that harness to use writing for real learning and not just continued funding. I hope you'll agree when we finish. And finally, we'll wrap up with our expectations and how we use those in responding and assessing our students' writing. Okay? So let's look at a writer, well-known writing teacher by the name of Peter Elbow, as in elbow. He framed responding to students' writing three ways. He broke it down into three types. I've chosen to talk about liking first. We have, in a way, touched on that already. Responding to students' process writing when you're not evaluating or not grading is, in a way, a evaluation-free zone, as Elbow put it. And I have to say, from personal experience, it's a very different approach when you, as an instructor, give yourself the liberty to like a student's writing and respond that way without thinking about, for the moment, having to assess it or evaluate it. And I've seen that attitude also affect the way the students continue their writing. And of course, there's the ranking, which we all are called on to do at certain points. Giving a grade to a student in a class, giving a score, or deciding on a placement. And finally, evaluating, where we make a determination, where we judge a student's work. And we do that when we respond to drafts. So, this is Peter Elbow's take on it. There's another way of looking at it, as I mentioned earlier, and that's the role we take. And let's look at the teacher as a reader, first of all. By now in the workshop, you've already had experience with some of the BARD college approaches. It's BARD. And so this is responding, first of all, to your students' writing as a reader, as an interested reader. Why? As we've talked about before, to encourage more writing. If you show an interest in what the student has written, then that, by definition, should encourage the student to write more. It's a dialogue. Then there's teacher's coach. And these are what we know, having asked students what kind of feedback they would like. We know that students need complete statements, complete questions from an instructor, if they're marginal comments or if they're prose comments. We know that they respond better if they're framed in a positive tone. Students really would prefer text-specific comments rather than general, overall. Well, sometimes overall summative, but it would help them to have very specific guides on what to change and what to do differently. And we'll talk more about this later, but it's really important to address meaning, organization, issues of understanding and interpretation first, what we call the large-scale issues. And this last one connects with the positive direction, and that is make suggestions rather than don't do this. What might the student do differently in a next draft? So we have teacher's reader, teacher's coach, and then alas, we must have teacher's judge. And again, we know students appreciate praise, and specifically with older writers, praise with specific reasons. What is positive about the writing? Again, they want in final judgments, they want specific comments that are clear. And they appreciate suggestions along with criticism. Makes sense, I think. Linda.
When Rosemary and I were at a conference recently, someone used the phrase, write to the student, not to the text. And I've been thinking about that even after all these years, about what it means to address a student rather than simply comment on the text. It's another way of, I hope, in addition to that.
Well, something as simple as writing what you did here, as opposed to, there seems to be a problem here. I mean, setting up the you, I think, is setting up a dialogue and encouraging really a personal response.
And even starting with the student's name.
Sure.
Yeah. John, you did a lot of work on this paper.
Right, right. No, I think that's very true, very true. Yeah, thanks for adding that. Now, there's ways of breaking down assessments. And assessments where we do evaluation now. One is to consider formative and the other is summative. Formative is, as you would assume, assessing the process, assessing writing in progress, whereas summative is assessing the result. So remember, we're back now to the distinction between process and product. So let's have a look at formative. And we've already talked about formative, really responding to a draft that will lead to a final draft is a formative kind of assessment. And these are some examples. So again, informative, the emphasis on things like concept development, or in science, the development of a procedure, making sure the student is on the right track with the large-scale issues, right? Again, it's process writing. It's giving feedback on process writing. So we can include some types of assessment in process writing if you choose. Other types that people have used in the past with good results. Varies how you use them by age, that influences by type of student, by subject. But you have teachers who use logs. This is really records of students' progress. And it could be weekly, throughout the semester, or quarter, or more often, or end of quarter progress reports. And this would be done for individual students, either as a checklist or as in discourse form. And of course there are rubrics. And we've already talked, and we'll be talking a lot more about rubrics in the workshop. Just let me mention that they are for the instructors' assistants and for the students, so that both really have an agreement of what is being assessed and what the goals of the assessment are. Another that has been used a lot recently is a portfolio assessment, and this differs somewhat from the first two. First of all, it's longitudinal. It's a collection of samples over time. And it's collaborative. What do I mean by that? Students participate in deciding what is included in a portfolio. The writer participates. So it's a joint decision about what would be included, what kinds of pieces, and it's very diverse. It can be informal pieces and very formal pieces. Usually of some length, but there can be fragments included depending on the type of course and subject matter. What's also, I think, very important is that just the act of choosing implies some reflection. The idea of what should be included for what reason is a way of having the student assess and evaluate his or her own work. And very often this becomes more formalized by having a student write an introductory letter to the portfolio. So once the quarters or semesters or years' work is collected, the writer, in this case maybe the teacher as well, but certainly the writer, writes an introduction to the portfolio. What is included and why? What were the reasons the pieces were selected? I should add that these have been used within classes and also within programs, and sometimes even at a state level. So there are a wide variety of ways and levels at which these have been used. And we have working portfolios. You might call those formative. They change as they go, and they're used for the purpose of encouraging change and supporting it as coach. And there are final, which are used for summative purposes. Placement in the next year, or maybe part of the grade, or at least credit for the year's work. So either within a class or within a program. So that's a quick overview of formative. Let's consider some summative tests. When we talk about summative tests, let's step back from the classroom and consider the large-scale tests. By these I mean standardized, in some cases standardized tests, whether they're in-house or statewide or nationwide. Now, summative assessment is used for achievement purposes and to assess whether there's mastery of the content or a skill. So some of these are commercially available, like the first one, the New Jersey High School Proficiency Test. A large-scale test that is administered to high school students that is an indirect writing test. What does that mean? It's a test that looks at writing in a very objective way, but indirectly. So students are asked to choose alternative possibilities for a sentence, the best sentence to fit in a specific context. Or they might be asked to reformulate a sentence to fit better in a context, and they're given choices of which might be the best formulation. They might be asked to combine sentences, and again, it's a multiple choice. Or they might be asked to identify errors. How does this work with deaf students? Not very well. We've conducted comparisons of this type of test with direct samples, which we'll talk about, and found that for placement, they are less valid than direct writing tests. I think you can guess why. Language learners have a difficulty while they're acquiring the language to recognize error, and to be able to put it on a test is a challenging task, to have students select from multiple errors what might be the best option. So it really targets, in some cases, our students' weakest area. So another type of test that's used widely is a direct form, where students are asked to write in response to a prompt. So you have an actual sample of the student's writing. And I picked one example of an in-house test that we use here at NTID to place students coming into our developmental curriculum in an English language course in the developmental sequence. Those students are asked to write in response in a very limited time period to this prompt. Then the prompt, or the sample, is rated holistically by a group of trained raters. We've talked about now kinds of assessment, kinds of the different hats that you as an instructor can wear in responding and assessing. And I think we need to step back from that for a moment and consider what really is very basic to assessing, and that is that it align well with the curriculum. So we can't expect something of our students that we don't teach them. That seems like a truism, but sometimes we forget. The way we assess needs to match up well with the goals of our teaching and with the processes we use to teach it. So to bring it home, if you're teaching biology, then your main concern should always be the content and the expression of the content, and not English grammar, with the caveat that, of course, it needs to be intelligible English. So those three need to line up for assessment to be valid for you and for the student. Now, when we're talking about assessment, we need to consider where students fall short. What are the errors? Well, the content instructor needs to be concerned about both, of course, meaning and form. But as we've continued to discuss this week, we focus on meaning first. That is on content and organization. And hopefully hold the language for a later consideration in the process. It's also important that we remember that that the student is faced with many new tasks, and that there is a specific cognitive load when the student is trying to write about a new content for a new audience in a second language. And that will all have an effect on the written product. If the load is high in content and audience, then we would expect sometimes the language will break down. And as a colleague of ours has said, not all errors are created equal. What do we mean by that? Well, I think actually we've talked about it earlier this week, that what we want to focus on are the errors that affect comprehension. We're not really so concerned about the surface grammatical errors that do not interrupt the reader's ability to understand the content. That's our first task. And that needs to be the student's primary thought in writing, that not all of the surface errors are going to be eliminated. And this distinction is sometimes called a difference between global and local errors. Global meaning things like arrangement, sentence connectors, tense changes, things that would disrupt the overall flow of the piece, and connection, transition, coherence of the piece. Those are probably more serious and need to be addressed up front. We've talked about deaf students learning a second language, and hearing students For both, it's a lifelong process, especially regarding the vocabulary and grammar. There are some unique characteristics in deaf students' writing that you may find as someone new to deaf students' writing, and those are things like not mastering multiple meanings to a term, very common term, or being unsure about word class. For example, using beauty, beautiful, and beautify interchangeably. So there's, even with very advanced writers, there's sometimes a confusion of word class. Of course, common idioms and two-word verbs in English are a constant challenge for second language learners. So some of these are common in deaf students' writing. It's also important to keep in mind that deaf students may have limited experience with certain functions and uses of writing, especially in academic environments. We know that response is crucial. Deaf students need and depend on feedback to progress and to develop. And I think we'd all agree that the more formative assessment we can provide, the better. Understand it's very time-consuming, but it's time well spent. And I just kind of wanted to put writing in the disciplines in a historical context, one that I think has been really beneficial to the field of teaching writing. And this, not coincidentally, happened about the time when there was a sea change in teaching writing. In